There's war in our future. I hate to tell you that, but we need to understand it in terms of the Bible. And here to talk about future war and the Bible is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis. Bob, if I can call you that, welcome to Prophecy Watchers.
Well, thank you for having me, Gary. It's my pleasure.
You have a military background, and I'd like to for you to let folks know who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing right now. What led you to write Future War?
Well, Gary, I entered the military at age 18, went to West Point. 4 years later, after graduating, I spent 20 years in the Army as an infantryman, 4 different divisions on 3 different continents. Subsequently, I worked in Washington at a think tank, Family Research Council, as vice president, working on national security and foreign affairs issues all over the world. And then I'm back in the Pentagon now for 14 years, where I'm a senior strategist. And I also teach at the Army War College, where I train people from all over the world on security cooperation. And this particular book, because I'm a Christian, I believe in Bible prophecy, I see things that most Americans will never see. And I can translate that into the vernacular, the threats that we face, the world that we're coming to, and what it means biblically for our future.
You know, most of us, I think probably all we see of the military is what's publicized on television, and it's highly politicized. From our perspective as civilians. We see the political aspects of the military. What's going on in the Middle East is tempered by what the president did or didn't do, right, or what Congress did or didn't do. You see things in an entirely different way.
Well, I really do. You know, you have 1.3 million people associated with the current active duty and reserve component military. And most Americans, based on polling, have a very high opinion of the military, and rightly so. We've done a great job. But I'm inside the belly of the beast. I see the political appointees that run things. I see the generals. I see the privates. I have a different perspective because I've seen a military over since the late 1960s to the present that has radically changed in terms of how it tolerates the world in which it lives, how it is coerced by political winds of those that are in the White House and those that are appointed and placed over the generals.
Now, as I go into Bob's book, and again, it's called Future War, really detailed assessment of where we are right now. I'm looking at page 32 here, anticipated shifts between now and 2030. And the tenor of this book is that we're in the process of some rapid change, not only in political and economic realms, but the military is changing in ways that I don't think the average civilian understands.
Well, the military has changed in terms of who it brings in, how it trains those people, and of course the weapons that they employ, the technologies, and geopolitically how we operate across the globe. Part of my job in training people is that in security cooperation, we deal with 160 some odd nations around the world and how we build coalitions, how we fight wars. And of course the social agendas. We've been imposed a social agenda that is pro-homosexual, pro-transgender, anti-Christian. Things like that have been brought in not only by the Obama administration, but by even the Bush administration to a certain degree, and before that. And so we are kind of morphing the military into something that it's never been. Most Americans, though they have a positive attitude about it, they don't even know anyone in the military today. They've never had a meal with anyone in the military. Yeah. And so it's a very different world that we live in today for the military as well as the type of world we live in.
Now we tend to plan, I think all of us in our daily planning, and this would go all the way up the ladder to the Pentagon. Yeah. We tend to plan on what's now, what we see right now, and not what might happen in 10 years from now. And this book, as I read it, I've got to tell you, there were times when cold chills went down the back of my neck because things are changing. Uh, Bob and I were talking before we went on today about self-driving cars on the highway. And people are saying now that cars will be driving themselves here in about 10 years. Driverless cars, well, that implies a brain. We're talking about a robot. Robotics and artificial intelligence. And, you know, as I read your book and you're talking about all this being in the military, suddenly it gives you pause. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay, well, really the transgender, not transgender, but transhumanist agenda, where you try to, quote, get the best out of machines and humans.
Yeah.
You want to optimize the human's lifespan, their ability physically, and their mental abilities. They want us all to be Einsteins, which would be nice, and I don't like to forget things, but what the transhumanists are trying to do is really morph the military into super soldiers. Now, at the same time, we're going to have these cyborgs, these part human, part machine. We talk about building an exoskeleton that's climate controlled, that is ballistically protected from objects trying to hit us or electronic cyber types of things. We'll have mechanical, robotic weapons associated with us. We'll give them better vision, better hearing, all sorts of capabilities. Even if they're wounded, they'll be able to do the injection of certain types of medicines and things to stop the bleeding and to heal, to allow us to overcome sleep deprivation. This started about 1990 with a general by the name of Paul Gorman, and Paul said to this organization, secret organization called DARPA, that we want to develop a super soldier, and he outlined what it was going to look like. Now that's the cyborg part, Gary, but the other part are the robotics. Now, which will have artificial intelligence. Now, you may have some of that through chips that are put in the brains of cyborgs, but the robotics, we see some of it today, thanks to the Russians, where they're beginning to be able to fight and to not have a conscience and be able to do kinetic operations that are rather scary. So this is an evolution, something that is here and now, and in fact, in another year and a half, the Special Operations Command down at Tampa is going to have what's called Talus, which is the first generation of this cyborg type of exoskeleton with all this equipment available.
Wow. And we're talking sci-fi now.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting, we live in a science fiction culture. People for entertainment go to the movies, and people are cranking out a sci-fi movie about every 3 weeks, and they feature things like artificial intelligence and robotic suits that people can wear. And so I think people have a tendency to just look at this in terms of science fiction, maybe 100 years into the future. And you're telling us we're closed.
It's here and now, and we think that the Chinese and the Russians are moving just as quickly. We have seen some elements of it already on the battlefield, whether it's been in Syria or Ukraine, and I suspect it's going to get much worse, much more deadly. You know, where we can sit back and watch like we do with operating drones, we can operate these cyborgs, communicating directly with them, or they're communicating to weapons just with thoughts that they have in their brains. And of course, that's going to be interface with satellites. It's going to interface with weapons that are far from where they happen to be. Like I say, much like we operate drones from the United States over Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world.
If you're that far from the front, you're sitting in some room operating a drone that can wipe out somebody on the ground. Your conscience in the matter tends to be dulled a bit.
What does?
You might be thinking about going to lunch or something, and meanwhile your drone is over there several thousand miles away getting ready to kill somebody. That's crazy almost. The spiritual and conscious issues are just dampened. They're thinned out until they would no longer exist, I would think.
Take one step beyond what we all recall on 9/11, pictures of Mr. Obama and Hillary Clinton and others sitting around watching real time as we went into Abbottabad in Pakistan to take down Osama bin Laden. We saw that, and we still have that capability. But just imagine if they were cyborgs. and we had chips, which we work with, in their brains, in which they didn't have to talk on the phone. They could basically understand what they were thinking, and they were able to execute without thinking twice on movements of the adversary or whatever. I can see that very clearly evolving in the next year or two. That we have a foundational capability that's going to only grow in more complexity and killing power in the very, very near future.
I am just stricken by what I'm hearing because I'm thinking of society. Europe, America, South America, Canada. I'm thinking about the millions of innocent people going about their daily life and thinking that pretty much everything is okay, and all this is going on in the background that you're talking about. And we do read in the Bible about the great wars that are just ahead, and I think a lot of us who study Bible prophecy are looking at a World War III that will involve Israel very heavily. And I think you would concur with that, right?
Absolutely. What is happening, Gary, is that, in a bit of history here, we had what we call the first offset strategy that began under Eisenhower, in which he looked at the Soviets and he saw 172 divisions of forces, hundreds of thousands and hundreds of thousands. We couldn't really put together a conventional force to fight that, so he created the nuclear force. That lasted until 73, and the Soviets built a giant nuclear force. Then what we did in the second offset strategy is put together all these sophisticated precision-guided munitions, and the Soviets were long in coming to bear. And in fact, it was the Star Wars agenda that Ronald Reagan put together that finally defeated the Soviet Union. Well, they have almost caught up at that point, and now we're beginning the third offset strategy, which has all these complex technologies, such as the super soldier, the cyborgs, but also things in space, things in cyber, very sophisticated and dangerous weapons of mass destruction. And all of this, of course, we have the background of terrorism, and we have a very frightening, evolving future world in which we're going to live, where power is diffused and we no longer have the security of our homeland to fall back on.
The book is Future War. You owe it to yourself, particularly as a student of Bible prophecy, to read this book. Very early in the book here, and around about page 40, I ran across the term black swan.
Yes.
And if you inject that into what Bob has been saying up to now, it makes an interesting scenario. Tell us about the black swan.
Well, a long time ago, Europeans only thought of swans as being white. And then all of a sudden, somebody went to Australia, of all places, and they found a black swan. So something that is totally unexpected, something that, this is what black swan, the expression, has become, something that's preventable and so forth. Now, 9/11 was a black swan event. We knew some of the ingredients. We could have stopped it on 9/10, but it happened and it had catastrophic implications.
Yes.
Well, there are black swans in our future. Now, when they're going to happen, I don't know. We could have pandemics like Ebola that we saw in Liberia a year ago that could break out across our land, either man-made or nature available, that could be spun up in a shopping mall or in a city and devastate an entire population. We have black swans in the currency markets, whether the euro could fall given what's going on over there. We have black swans, just an asteroid could hit the earth. Or we could have more wars, things that just are totally unanticipated, an explosion of a weapon. Things that we're working on, and some of the people in the world are working on, are altering genetics so that they can destroy food supply, water supplies. They can stop a population from reproducing.
Wow.
There are a lot of possible black swans that are going to influence our future. We've seen black swans in the past. The biggest one that we're all expecting is the return of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
That's a big black swan that's going to change everything. But until that happens, there are going to be other black swans that are going to alter the course of civilization, that are going to come on top of shifts and changes and megatrends that are all going to shape the future, along with all these threats that I've outlined in Future War.
imminent trends in a world that is all but out of control these days. I get the feeling that because of technology, because of the economic grid out there that's highly unstable right now, that things are moving in ways that nobody predicted. And yet, you do a pretty good job, I think, in this book of predicting what might happen in the very near future. Now, let's go to the next idea here. Let's integrate the Bible into this just a little bit. Early on, you said that Christians and Christian thinking are no longer considered desirable in today's military. Men, spiritual men. We used to think of spiritual men in places of leadership in the military. To me, this changes everything. When the our conscience is removed from the military. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the lack of conscience, especially when you're talking about remote killing or making major decisions about the future of your country or defending your country.
Yeah.
These are all scary elements. You know, as a past ethics instructor at the Army's infantry school, I talked about the catastrophes, the melees of the world, where there was, just man went off the deep end and did terrible atrocities. Well, that's what I'm concerned about, because the way in which we used to reinforce people to keep them from doing those sorts of things was by having a conscience, and especially a spiritual conscience that is sympathetic and empathetic to those that are downtrodden or those that need help. And yet I see that we're beginning to lose that as a culture, and the culture is influencing the military. And of course, if they're being influenced politically to go in a very different direction than we have in the past, that's dangerous. That's dangerous for us. It's dangerous for the innocents on the battlefield. You see that played out today in Aleppo, where the Syrians and the Russians are bombing innocents with chlorine gas or VX gas, a nerve agent.
Chlorine gas, of all things. I mean, that goes back to World War I, and people, and chlorine and mustard gases and so forth and so on. And we went through a long, long period of time, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, where people began to debate the ethics of using those kinds of weapons. And it was thought for a long time that the ethical standard had caught up with the use of poison gases and they would no longer be used anymore. But there they are again.
They are again. And in fact, I would argue a biological agent that we've talked about as being wrong to spread smallpox or anthrax or whatever, a biological agent actually could be a cyborg. You know, a cyborg is a living organism that happens to have extra powers, can run very fast, lift heavy weights, and kill effectively and efficiently. And yet they could be a biological agent of the future.
You know, what the image that's in my mind right now, Bob, is the Terminator.
Yes.
The movie that was made so long ago, Arnold Schwarzenegger made a very good Terminator, and we were of mixed emotions about the Terminator. He could be a really, really bad guy, could be a good guy, but he was somebody you really wouldn't want to be close to. And we all thought, well, this is interesting fiction. It makes for a good yarn. But you keep talking about real Terminators.
Real Terminators that have artificial intelligence that don't have a conscience.
Wow.
And
no conscience.
And the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs said just a week ago that his concern is that our enemies, the Chinese and the Russians, I consider them enemies, are actually developing Terminators much like we are, robots that have artificial intelligence. What they do, they learn the artificial intelligence about everything around them, and they learn how to react, and then they learn how to kill. Now, what we have said, we want to put in the kill process a human being, much like we have operating drones from Nevada that are operating over Pakistan. We want somebody in that process that has a conscience, that has a moral foundation. Our enemies won't do that. What we will do, hopefully, is to have that moral conscience. But we live in a fallen world, a world in which certain people will do things that are not necessarily things that we would endorse and won't be good, I think, long term for the country.
Now, let me ask a question, and in some respects I know the answer because I've read your book, but is there competition going on as far as these terminators are concerned? I guess DARPA are developing these, the Army Research Projects Administration. How about the Russians? How about the Chinese? Are they moving forward with this sort of thing?
Every piece of research that we're doing, whether it's on cyborgs or it's on AI or it's on genetic alteration or it's on hypersonics, weapon systems, space weapon systems, and so forth, they're all working on it. And in fact, the Russians and Chinese in some cases are ahead of us. We're just beginning in the third offset strategy of the United States to try to catch up, or at least to stay a little bit ahead. But things are changing at such a rapid rate, Gary, that it's hard to say whether or not at the next encounter, where it's a vicious encounter, a deadly encounter, that we're actually going to have the advantage.
One of the things you talk about here is outer space war.
Yes.
Now, again, it's science fiction. More and more, Bob, I find myself walking around in a science fiction world where you don't have to go to the theater and pay your $5 for a ticket or whatever, and to see what is going to be happening in the future. It's here right now. The things that we've always thought would be maybe 10, 15, 20, probably 30 years ahead. You're saying it's all here right now.
Yeah, the 21st century will be defined as the militarization of space. The United States military is dependent totally upon its global satellite systems. The Chinese understand that, the Russians understand that.
Yes.
Last October, the Chinese demonstrated a very effectiveness by shooting down one of their own satellites and demonstrating to us that they could do likewise. In fact, earlier this summer, the Chinese put into orbit a roaming robot that has an arm that could actually pick up space junk, but also could destabilize and destroy one of our satellites. And of course, we have many of them up there. The Russians are doing much the same. I see a future. You can look at scripture and you can say at some point we're going to look into the skies and it's going to be fearfully create fear, it's going to create distress, because I can envision laser weapon systems targeting specific targets from on high, whether on a satellite or an asteroid or on the moon.
Wow. Pardon me, but that sounds like what the Bible says about the Antichrist. He's able to call down fire from heaven.
Yes.
If he had control of this kind of military, he could certainly call down that kind of fire from heaven. Is that what you're saying?
He could, or he could also control all these cyborgs that could do his bidding anywhere that he sent them. We talk about electromotive forces, EMPs, that are through conventional or nuclear weapons that are exploded above the Earth.
Right.
We already have a little satellite the North Koreans put up. All they have to do is put aboard a nuclear device. Just here in the last 48 hours, the North Koreans did their 5th nuclear test, not counting the one they did in January on hydrogen bombs. And of course, just a week or so ago, they launched a submarine-launched ballistic missile effectively. So they have all the ingredients, and they've threatened to annihilate us if given the chance. So are the Iranians. So these things are proliferating. If you were to look into the future and anticipate maybe in 10 years where we're going to be in terms of the space threats, there will be a militarized outer space. The Russians, the Chinese will be there. We will be there. We will have laser capabilities. We will have other capabilities that are just things that used to be in the comic books and science fiction. No longer. We have those capabilities, and they're getting out of control.
A lot of us think about this has become popular thinking. I think on the internet, news media all over the world occasionally talk about the electric power grid going down. And you've got a section in your book that talks about cyber risks,
Yes.
that talk about the threat to the power grid. Now, I've got another question I want to ask you, but first talk about the power grid.
Yeah, just a couple days ago, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, made it very clear that we're constantly being attacked by the Russians and by the Chinese and by non-state actors. I know at the Pentagon, they're constantly, thousands if not millions of times a day, hit by the likes of the Chinese SSF, which is an organization, their fifth service, that now includes cyber and space and electronic warfare. They're very serious about this. They are doing us grave harm. They're stealing our technology. Yes, they can shut down our electric grid. We believe that they've already implanted these programs in a lot of our systems that operate our electric grid, and we'll only have to turn them on. Much like, allegedly, the Israelis did the Stuxnet program they put into nuclear reactors in Iran. Cyber is something you can't see, you can't feel, but it's deadly, and it is coming right now.
There is so much more I'd like to talk about with Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis, but this, I must tell you right now, Future War is the book, 1995. ProphecyWatchers.com, go to our online bookstore and you can order it. You'll find Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis. His name will be right there in the bookstore, and you'll find a couple of books. The other is the one that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, but I think on our next program with him we will. It's called Never Submit. Will the extermination of Christians get worse before it gets better? And I want to turn to some more deeply involved Christian questions the next time we get together and talk, because what should all of us do as Christians in light of what you're revealing? Let me say again, the book is Future War. It's 1995. Never Submit, 1995. Order the Future War package in our online bookstore, both books for $34.95. And they are worth your time. I have read Future War. I'm in the process of reading Never Submit, and we'll finish that probably here in a couple of days. And I want you to know it's valuable information. We have a few seconds going out. Bob, talk to the Christian audience. What should we be praying for?
Well, we pray for Christian leaders. We clearly need people that embrace biblical values and biblical principles. We need people that recognize that they have a God-given responsibility in Romans 13 to participate in their government and to influence that government to do the righteous things. Don't abandon that. Until Christ comes, we need to be actively involved.
Indeed we do. You know, it's time. And I think the one thing we can all agree on is we are there. And when I say we are there, I mean at the prophetic moments that are written about in the Bible. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. And the evidence is just overwhelming, Gary. And it's sobering. We need to take responsibility for where God has placed us to be useful for his purposes until he calls us home.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, we've got to talk more. We have run out of time. I'm Gary Stearman. We're watching. You keep watching too. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.